itself. And to be here with Elliott Books, you know, independent bookstores, independent media, this wonderful space I consider all sanctuaries of dissent. And a very special thank you to Dennis Moynihan, without whom, along with my brother, journalist David Goodman, this book would never have been written. 100-city tour would never have been undertaken. He is a tour guide extraordinaire. It was his birthday this week, and I decided after we came back through California twice, after going to Sarasota, Florida, and New Orleans and Georgia, and now here we are in Washington State, we're in Arizona and New Mexico, heading to Minneapolis and Cambridge, Massachusetts, and back to New York, and then heading to Chicago, that I'm going to get him a map for his birthday. Dennis is an incredibly talented writer, and I call him the Johnny Appleseed of independent media. Democracy Now! Began 20 years ago as the only daily election show in public broadcasting. We were on 9 community radio stations, the Pacifica 5, KKFI in Kansas City that Leonard Peltier used to listen to, Chaos in Olympia, KBCS would come on board soon after that. We've been together for 16 years, which is truly amazing. And we thought the show would wrap up right after Election Day, and it was 9 months later. This was the election, 1996, of Bill Clinton, the re-election. He was running against Bob Dole and Ross Perot. Dennis mentioned Leonard Peltier, who is, again, seeking clemency. We will see what happens. President Obama just granted clemency to scores of people, Leonard Peltier not among them. But I remember getting a chance to ask a previous president that question about Peltier. Yes, it was Election Day 2000. And maybe some of you heard this conversation, this unexpected conversation on the air. So, it was Election Day 2000 in the morning, and at that time we had 2 producers, and my colleagues, Maria Carrion had just flew in from Madrid. She was one of our producers, as well as Brad, and they had, and which reminds me how much I appreciate deeply committed to the committed group of journalists and videographers, the magicians that make Democracy Now! Happen every single day. This week we're traveling with Laura Gottesdiener, who's out preparing the weekend's escapades, journalism, investigations. Last week with Mike Burke, our senior producer, and the week before that with Amy Littlefield. John Hamilton, our former colleague at Democracy Now! Comes in and out of our lives to cover all the UN climate summits, as well as the conventions, and he's over there busily filming. And a special welcome to Erin Dooley, our new Director of Development, who has joined us for the first time this week, and we're so honored to have her with us. But this morning, it was just the awesome two. It was Election Day 2000. They'd already run into the studio to begin the show, and I was quickly coming in behind, but I heard the phone ring. Now, how often would someone call right before the show? Almost never, unless it was a breaking story. And I really let that phone ring as the music began to swell in the studio. This is just when it was a radio show before we started on our first TV station. And I just picked up the phone really fast, and I said, "Hello, Democracy Now!" And they said, "White House Communications." And I thought they said White Horse Communications. There's a famous tavern in the village. Doug Thomas drank himself to death. And they said the president would like to speak to you. And I said, "The president of what?" The president of the tavern calling at 9 in the morning. communications. Listen, I've got to go on the air. I didn't know if it was real. Probably it was a hoax, I thought. And so I gave them the internal number, though, and hung up the phone, ran in. The music was there from Pacifica. This is Democracy Now! As we played the first clip, I said to Maria and Brad, hey, the president might call, definitely pick up the phone. Think in this next hour about questions you'd like to ask him. I actually don't think this is going to happen. They're going to 3, 2, 1, all that and more coming up. I think the students at Bellevue College got a little taste of this morning. Amazing crew. They were our crew this morning. We broadcast live on 1,400 stations from this morning. You know, we broadcast at 8 in the morning live in New York, and it's 5 o'clock here. It was pretty inspiring. When people ask what gives me hope, well, those students gave me enormous hope. So anyway, back to the story. 2000, we start the show, and it's a packed show. The president didn't call. I didn't really think much of it. I figured it was not real. And we were racing out for coffee after. You know, this was election day. It would be a very long day. We'd probably find out who was president after midnight. Hardly. This was Bush v. Gore. It would take 5 weeks at a selection, not an election. So we're racing out for coffee, and all of a sudden we hear from the control room, Gonzalo Alberto is doing Alternativa Latina, which is the alternative music show, Latina music show that morning, shouting, the president is on the phone, get in here now. We run into the control room. He is paralyzed. He's over the audio board. All the music faders are up, and the salsa music is blaring. All the microphones are down, and you hear President Clinton shouting, sort of being drowned out by the music. Is anyone there? So he and my producer, I threw myself under the board. I pushed up all of the microphones, and I didn't know which was which, but the faders for them, all the salsa music down, every music fader down, and then we sat down and I said, Gonzalo, this is going to be quite a ride. Think of some questions you get to ask him. And I said, hello, Mr. President. I understand you'd like to talk to people about getting out the vote. I hadn't said that. They said that he wanted to talk about this. You know, this was the year that Hillary Clinton was running for Senator of New York, and of course Al Gore was running for president. He said, that's right. I said, well, what do you say to those who are deeply concerned, who feel that both the Democratic and the Republican parties are captured by corporations? He launched right in and gave a full spirited response to why people should get out and vote. And so then I went on to ask him if he would be granting clemency to Leonard Peltier. I thought that followed perfectly. We talked about that. And together, Gonzalo and I asked questions about, well, would the U.S. Navy stop napalming and bombing the Puerto Rican island of Vieques? And we asked about the 2 UN Assistant Secretary Generals who had quit over the sanctions regime against Iraq. 500,000 children had died, calling that regime genocidal, the sanctions regime against Iraq. And I asked him what he thought about this, and continued to ask questions about war and the death penalty. Then I asked him a question about Ralph Nader, and I asked him if maybe, did he think that you could attribute Ralph Nader's success running for president to President Clinton himself for taking the Democratic Party to the right? And then he got annoyed. And he said, I find him hostile, combative, and at times disrespectful. So I said, just critical questions, and I just have a few more. So I then asked him, I said that Vice President Gore said if he became president, his first action would be an executive order It sounded like a very good thing, and I said, but you guys have been in office for 8 years. Why haven't you done that yet? Anyway, it was a full conversation. It went on for about half an hour, and then he said he had to go, and that was the alternative Latino music show that day. So, the next day, we ran it on Democracy Now! And then I got a call, you know, got all these headlines and everything, and I got a call from a reporter from New York Newsday, a big paper at the time in New York, and he was saying, you know, how did this happen? I was talking to him, but then the other phone rang, and so, and this is when we had wired phones, you know, so I said, oh, just 1 minute, please, and they said, White House Communications, and I knew it was the White House then. And they said, you're being banned from the White House. I said, I'm being banned? He called me, I didn't call him. I said, figure I have to go because the White House is on the line. He said, you just put the phone down, don't put me on hold, I'll be just fine. So I said, okay. So I put the phone down and I said, okay, this isn't fair. Why would you ban me? They said, we told you broke every rule of journalism. We set up a framework and you broke the protocol. I said, what are you talking about? I mean, I talked to them for all of 3 seconds before the show. And half of that time I thought it was a tavern I was talking to. Talking about it broke all the rules of good journalism. And they said, we told you that he wanted to encourage people to get out the vote, and that's what you could ask about. You asked question 1, 4, and 7 vaguely about that, but nothing else related. And I said, I asked 3 questions about what the president wanted to talk about. I'm really falling down on the job. I said, but it does sound like you have a transcript, you know, 1, 4, and 7. If you could send it to us, we always post our interviews online. It would be great to get it right up. And volunteers to us, so we can volunteer for the day. And then they said, I said to them, how many journalists did you call this morning in a New York radio station? They said, like over 40. I said, really? And they only asked about getting out the vote, and they said, that's right. And I said, that's a very sad comment on American journalism today. They said, we told you he had 2 or 3 minutes. You spent more than a half an hour on the phone. Oh my God, I mean, he's the leader of the free world. He's the most powerful person on earth. He can hang up if he wants to. But he did admit, well, he did have a very good time. So once I was finished with them, I hung up the phone and I realized, oh my God, that reporter's on the phone. So I picked up, I said, oh, I'm so sorry. I said, I got everything I need. Reporters shouldn't go on bended knee to those in power. Explicitly protected by the U.S. Constitution. Because we're supposed to be the check and balance on power. We have a very special role. The first book I wrote with my brother David was called The Exception to the Rulers, and that's what all the media should be. It shouldn't just be the motto of Democracy Now!, the exception to the rulers. The second one was called Static, and the reason we called it that is even in this high-tech digital age with high-tech television and digital radio, all we get is static. That veil of distortions and misrepresentations and half-truths that obscure reality. When what we need the media to give us is the dictionary definition of static: criticism, opposition, unwanted interference. We need a media that covers power, not covers for power. We need a media that is before the state, not for the state. And we need a media that covers the movements that create static and make history. I can't talk about these 20 years of Democracy Now!, growing from 9 stations to now over 1,400 television stations around the United States and around the world. Also, headlines translated to Spanish in transcript and audio form. If you're trying to learn Spanish, put the headlines in English up against the headlines in Spanish. It's a great way to do it. If you're trying to learn English, do the same thing, and you can listen to the Spanish and English. Teachers use it all over the world. But I can't talk about this last 20 years of Democracy Now! Without talking about my co-host for all that time, Juan Gonzalez. Started out as a young lord, one of the founders of this, sort of the Puerto Rican equivalent of the Black Panthers. And he was in New York. They would hijack tuberculosis vans and bring them to places in need, like the South Bronx. You never had so many willing hostage drivers, thankful that they could go to the places that they had originally got involved with medicine for. They would occupy churches in the South Bronx. In fact, Bernie Sanders just had a rally a few weeks ago at St. Mary's and St. Anne's Park, and I was talking to Juan about it. I went there just before this insane 100-city tour, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. And so when I came back to the studio the next day, I said, Juan, he said, oh my God, that's the park right next to the church that we occupied. And they would occupy these churches to ensure that young, poor children, Latino children, would get hot lunches and would get breakfast before they went to school, and they would serve them right there. So then Juan would become one of the leading journalists in this country. He worked at the Philadelphia Daily News, then he came to New York, where he was recruited by the publisher, editor, to be a columnist for the New York Daily News. And Juan, for the next 29 years, would write for one of the largest city papers in this country. How many of you heard Democracy Now! Or watched Democracy Now! This week? So, a few months ago, the whole team of Democracy Now! Went to Midtown Manhattan to Sardi's. I'd never been there before. Because Juan was the first Latino journalist being inducted into the New York Journalism Hall of Fame. Tables, there's a table for CBS, table, I think, for the New York Times, definitely for the New York Daily News. We got 2 tables because we were so proud of Juan. And when they called him up, we all stood up and said, Juan Gonzalez presente. And he gave an incredible speech that put all the other inductees to shame. Oh, who was being inducted? Max Franco, formerly with the New York Times, and Charlie Rose, and Leslie Stahl. But Juan, our Juan. Let me read you a little of what he had to say, commenting on his quarter of a century as a columnist at the Daily News. He said, I figured my modest contributions would be not writing about outcast neighborhoods, but from them. Not simply to entertain, but to change, not after the fact, but before it, when courage could still make a difference. I've tried to use as many of my columns as possible to probe the injustices visited upon the powerless. Yes, the rich and famous are also victims on occasion, but they have so many politicians, lobbyists, lawyers, gossip columnists, even editorial writers ready to jump to their defense that they'll always do fine without my help. He said, I prefer the desperate unknown reader who comes to me because he or she has gone everywhere else and no one will listen. More often than not, I come across unexpected gems, human beings whose tragedies illuminate the landscape and whose courage hopefully inspires the reader to believe that there is indeed some greater good served by a free press than just chronicling or influencing the ouster of one group of politicians by another. Those are the words of Juan Gonzalez. By saying this book celebrates some of the people and movements who've been making history during our first 20 years. It's not an exhaustive history, nor is it intended as a greatest hits of Democracy Now! This book is just our way of giving back by celebrating some of the ordinary heroes who've done extraordinary things to make the world a better place. And I speak to you today on the day that Dan Berrigan's funeral took place in New York at Xavier Church. 1,000 people packed in. I was so sorry I couldn't be there, but so glad still that I could be with you to talk about Dan and Phil. Father Dan, the Jesuit priest, and, well, he was Father Phil, a Josephite priest, his brother, until he met Liz McAllister, a nun. That was Phil Berrigan, and, well, the rest is history, and their 3 children. But Dan Berrigan, such an important figure in history. Dan Berrigan, a prophet of peace. Dennis and I wrote our column this week on the flight from, I think we landed in Spokane. We left Salt Lake City, and before that we had flown in from Sarasota. So we were making our way desperately trying to find wireless on the plane. It seems to me a lot of my time is spent looking for wireless and trying to find plugs to plug in my phone. To remember Father Dan Berrigan, that prophet of peace, who in 1968, along with his brother and 7 other activists, went to the Catonsville draft office and pulled out the A1 draft files, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, and took them outside and burned them with homemade napalm. Father Dan, as people affectionately called him, just before this action, was giving a talk up in Portland, Maine, where we're headed this weekend, and found a little quiet place in the airport to write up his statement. He didn't know if he'd ever get out of jail after they did this. And part of his statement explaining his action, he said, "Our apologies, good friends, for the fracture of good order, the burning of paper instead of children." We could not, so help us God, do otherwise, he said. He would be convicted along with the other 8. He would go underground. The FBI was looking for him everywhere. He would actually surface in different places. And the FBI would surround the place, like at Cornell. Dennis went to Cornell, and I think it was Bartlett Hall. And the FBI was waiting, so they didn't want to take him off on the stage. They'd wait till he came off the stage. And then some bread and puppet type puppets came out, and he was secreted into them and taken out in a puppet parade. He would eventually be found on Block Island off Rhode Island. And you see this famous picture of him with a big smile, surrounded by 2 joyless FBI men who seemed, to say the least, angry. They had posed as birders to arrest him. Dan Berrigan fought for peace and loved life. Dennis and I went to visit him a few years ago up at Fordham at a retirement home for elderly Jesuit priests. And Dan was there, still with a twinkle in his eye, though getting frail. He was 93. He died this year at 94. We brought him his favorite food, ice cream. Legend has it, or at least Jeremy Scahill told me, but now I'm not sure if it's true, that we should believe everything Jeremy does when he does his reporting, right? Blackwater and Dirty Wars, and now his most recent book, The Assassination Complex, with the team at The Intercept. But he said that Ben & Jerry's named a flavor after him, Raspberrigan. I don't know if that's true, so don't tweet it, don't quote me on it, but it's pretty cute. By the way, speaking of tweeting and quoting, and if you'd like to to sign up for our daily digest sign-up list. They're going around. We have wonderful volunteers that are passing them out. I think Dennis is too. It's a great way to keep up on our daily headlines. Or if you want to go paperless, you can just text from your phone the word Democracy Now!, one word, and you text it to 66866. You'll get a request for your email back. You'll text your email, and then the email will come to you, and you can just grant permission, and you'll be getting those news headlines in your email box. And if you tweet anything, any photographs, any comments, use the hashtag covering the movements. That's what we're doing on this 100-city tour. But when we went up to Dan, it was so wonderful to see him, to bring him his ice cream. Ben & Jerry's also gave him and all the Catholic workers a lifetime supply of ice cream. So when his niece, for example, Phil's daughter Frida, we just had on Democracy Now! Monday, remembering Dan, she could walk into any Ben & Jerry's and demand her favorite flavor, and we'd always get it. But yes, Dan Berrigan, how important he was, who said, "We have chosen to be powerless criminals in a time of criminal power. We have chosen to be branded as peace criminals by war criminals." Yeah. Rest in peace, Dan Berrigan, just as you lived. I want to talk about movements. The movements are what give us hope in the face of terrible calamities that befall us, that happen, that actually can be prevented. So I want to go back to last June, what happened in Charleston, South Carolina, the massacre that took place of 9 parishioners, well, 8, and their beloved pastor, Reverend Clemente Pinckney, who also was a South Carolina state senator for many years. It was midweek in June, and he raced back from the state legislature just because he wanted to do Bible study with those who wanted to gather to study. And they were in the Mother Emanuel Church. A young white man came in. They welcomed him, though they didn't know him. He sat with them for an hour and then blew them away. He saved the life. He did not kill one woman, telling her as he stood over her, "You can tell the world what you saw." This young white supremacist who wrapped himself in the Confederate flag. A few days later, the survivors and the loved ones of the victims put this country to shame when Dylan Storm Roof was arraigned, and they forgave him. I think Dylan Roof unwittingly blew the roof off the Confederacy. So what would happen next? A few days later, Reverend Clemente Pinckney, state senator Pinckney, would lay in state in a Capitol rotunda in Columbia, South Carolina, where he had worked. Thousands streamed by to pay tribute, and what did they see before they came into the rotunda? They had to pass outside the Confederate flag that waved high. All the flags of South Carolina, of course, were at half-mast for the beautiful 9. But this one, the Confederate flag on the grounds of the state capitol building, could not be brought down and flew at full mast. Why? Well, it was put up at the beginning of the 1960s in response to the civil rights movement on top of the state capitol building. Then in 2000, the NAACP and some sports franchises said that they would boycott if they didn't take it down. So the compromise of the legislature is they took it off the state capitol, put it on the capitol grounds, but there were rules, there were strings attached. It could never fly at anything but full mast. And if anyone dared to deface it or try to take it down, they would face an increased fine. They would face increased prison time. So that's the scene. A few days after Reverend Clemente Pinckney lay in state, there was the mass funeral for the 9 victims at the College of Charleston Arena. You know, Democracy Now! Raced down. We broadcast outside. Mother Emanuel went to the arena. Thousands were there. President Obama signed Amazing Grace. And the next day, the funerals continued one by one. But we left there because we heard something remarkable had taken place that next morning. It was 5:30 in the morning, June 27, 2015, 10 days after the massacre of the Emmanuel AME Church. You know, I think if most people were asked today, who ultimately took down the Confederate flag off the state capitol grounds, you know, the legislature ultimately would vote to take it down. But if you asked what one person was responsible, most people would probably say the South Carolina Governor, Nikki Haley, sort of led the charge. That's not who first took down the flag. It was a 30-year-old African-American woman named Brady Newsom. The South Carolina State House glowed in the morning light. Bree Newsom was from Charlotte, North Carolina. She walked toward the main entrance of the building. She was accompanied by Jimmy Tyson, a young white man from North Carolina, and others who scouted the grounds. They observed the scene around the State House, waiting until there were no guards visible. After about 30 minutes, Tyson and Newsom made their move. They walked swiftly toward the Confederate monument, which stands directly in front of the main steps. The tall monument, topped with a heroic image of a Confederate soldier, pays tribute to those who have glorified a fallen cause, slavery. The two activists proceeded to the 30-foot-high flagpole that stood directly behind the monument. The Confederate battle flag flapped lazily at the top. Bree Newsom donned her climbing gear, which she had learned how to use a few days before. And she made her way to the top of the flagpole. Guards noticed and began shouting at her to come down. Reaching the top of the flagpole, she grabbed the Confederate flag and unhooked it. She declared, "You come against me with hatred and oppression and violence. I come against you in the name of God." She clutched the symbol of the Confederacy and said, "This flag comes down today." Went viral, was seen around the world. Her bail fund quickly raised more than $125,000. Ava DuVernay, director of the Oscar-nominated film Selma, which you all should see, was among the many to hail her, tweeting, "I hope I get the call to direct a motion picture about a black superhero I admire. Her name is Bree Newsom." Could you imagine how the state could engage in this conscious act? I didn't say act of conscience, but this conscious act the day after the mass funeral for the beautiful 9, the few days after the massacre, that they would actually raise the Confederate flag once again. This, on the same day that the funerals were continuing and bodies were being lowered into the ground, the state raised the Confederate flag again. We were going to cover the funerals, but instead we raced to Columbia, to the jailhouse where Bree and Jimmy were taken. We didn't know if we could get in, and we ended up getting into the arraignment room, the arraignment cell. And there, Bree Newsom and Jimmy Tyson were charged with defacing state property, facing a penalty of up to 3 years in prison and a $5,000 fine. We then went to the lobby where people were gathering to greet the activists if they were let out. And I interviewed a young woman named Tamika Lewis. She'd come with Bree from North Carolina to help with the action. She said to see the flag actually come down and all the things it represents being taken down by a strong black woman was one of the greatest symbolic images one person could ever witness. Then another young woman named Carol Parker, who lived in Columbia, didn't know Bree at all, but knew the indignity of walking past that Confederate flag every day of her growing up, said, Bree has done what our governor hasn't had the courage to do, what our General Assembly hasn't had the courage to do. She went up there and did what had to be done when it needed to be done. Let it to be told from the rooftops. It was Bree Newsom that took down the symbol of the Confederacy in Columbia, South Carolina. Rosa Parks, and even the story of Rosa Parks the media gets wrong. How did they get it wrong? We all learn about Rosa Parks, that great woman who stood up for all of us by sitting down in a bus and refusing to get up for a white passenger and then was arrested. No, we all know that story. But when Rosa Parks died a few years ago, I was watching CNN, and they said Rosa Parks was a tired seamstress. She was not a troublemaker. That's where they got it wrong. Rosa Parks was a first-class troublemaker. She knew exactly what she was doing. Rosa Parks sat down the bus December 1st, 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, refuses to get up for a white passenger. She's arrested. 4 days later, she goes to court, and the Montgomery Improvement Association has a meeting, and it chooses their leader to lead the bus boycott that would bring down the segregated transportation system of Montgomery. They choose as their leader a young minister who just moved into town. His name was Dr. Martin Luther King. Rosa Parks helped to launch Dr. Martin Luther King. Rosa Parks was the secretary of the local NAACP. She worked under E.D. Nixon. He came out of radical labor politics. He worked with A. Philip Randolph, one of the greatest organizers of the 20th century, who organized the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Thousands of black conductors on the trains all called George. I mean, they weren't named George by their mothers, but they were called George because of the Pullman trains owned by George Pullman, Pullman, Washington. And that sort of gives you an indication of why they needed to be organized. But A. Philip Randolph would then later go on to organize the 1963 March on Washington with the black, gay, pacifist activists by arresting. Where Dr. King gave his I Have a Dream speech. And A. Philip Randolph was the activist who was brought by Eleanor Roosevelt to meet her husband, President FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And he sat with Roosevelt, described the condition of black people in this country, of working people in this country. FDR sat silently, and when he was done, he said, I don't disagree with anything you've said, but you'll have to make me do it. And interestingly, when Senator Obama was first running for president, he was campaigning in the backyard of a New Jersey home. And about 100 people were there, and someone raised their hand and said, what are you going to do about the Middle East, the Israel-Palestine conflict? And Senator Obama at the time retold the story of A. Philip Randolph meeting with FDR and responded by giving FDR's response, make me do it. Make me do it. That's just an interesting little side note. But this is the tradition that Rosa Parks came out of. She was an activist. The media denigrates activists, but what could be more noble than dedicating your life to making the world a better place? So Pete Seeger, right before he died, he came on Democracy Now! And talked about being at Highlander, perfecting the song, We Shall Overcome. It was sort of an old folk song. And I was just in Sarasota, and someone asked me to sign their book to Frank Hamilton. You know, the guy, they said, who worked with Pete Seeger to, put the finishing touches on this song, and he's still alive in Florida. But Pete talked about, finishing up the song, and then who walks in but Dr. King, who asked him to sing it for him. So Pete sang "We Shall Overcome" to Dr. King, and he said Dr. King walked out of the room and said, "That's a catchy tune." The civil rights movement. This is where Rosa Parks comes from. I mean, Rosa Parks had sat down on the bus before, like many other young women, and refused to get up. You never know when that magic moment will come. I think about the kayaktivists here. The breakaway movement that's going to be engaging in all sorts of actions next weekend. And you did everything you could to stop oil drilling in the Arctic, but that ship got away from you, went to the Arctic, and then Shell announces they will be withdrawing from the Arctic. What the media tells it is, Shell changed their mind. But I think we know who changed Shell's mind. I hesitate to say the word mind. I don't exactly think corporations are people. You never know when that magic moment will come. But if you engage in social change, you will help to build a foundation that will determine the future, that will make history. And that's just what Rosa Parks did. And to show how brave she was, just go back a few months to the summer of '55, the summer of Emmett Till, the summer of a 14-year-old African-American boy. His mother, Mamie Till, in Chicago, wanted him out of the city for the summer, so sent him to be with his aunt and uncle and cousins in Money, Mississippi. He was asleep with his cousins in bed when a white mob came and ripped him out of bed. They said he had wolf whistled at a white woman. Emmett was a stutterer. His mother taught him, whenever you feel that stutter coming on, whistle. Emmett ended up in the bottom of the Tallahatchie River. When his body was dredged up and sent back to Chicago for the funeral, Mamie Tilson did something incredibly brave. She said she wanted the casket open for the wake and the funeral. She wanted the world to see the ravages of racism and brutality and bigotry. Thousands of people streamed by and saw his distended, mutilated head, and then Jet Magazine and other black publications actually photographed his head, and those photographs were published. And they were seared into the history and consciousness of this country. Mamie Till had something very important to teach the press of today. Show the pictures. Show the images. Can you imagine if for just 1 week we saw the images of war? Above the fold of every surviving newspaper, you see a photograph of a baby dead on the ground in Afghanistan, and there was an article about her, and you actually learned her name. A name dignifies a life, and you learned who her parents were and what they had hoped for their child. If the top of every radio and TV newscast talked about a woman who died in a drone strike in Yemen who was attending a wedding party, and you learned about the young couple who'd fallen in love and why this party and where this party was. If everyone's Facebook wall, on everyone's Facebook wall, every tweet, every email for a week referred to a soldier dead and dying, for just 1 week, Americans are a compassionate people. They would say, no, war is not the answer to conflict in the 21st century. Pacific Radio, which was founded 67 years ago. We were just celebrating the 67th birthday of the first station, KPFA, in Berkeley, California. It was founded by a war resister named Lou Hill, who was a conscientious news objector, came out of the detention camps after World War II, said there's got to be a media outlet not run by corporations that profit from war, but run by journalists and artists. And that's how Pacifica was born. The first station, KPFA in Berkeley in 49. George Gerbner, the late dean of the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Pennsylvania, would say, not run by corporations that have nothing to tell and everything to sell, that are raising our children today. The second station, KPFK in Los Angeles, 1959. My station in New York, 1960, WBAI. In its first years, it would broadcast a debate between the great writer James Baldwin and Malcolm X over the effectiveness of nonviolent civil disobedience, the lunch counter sit-ins in the South. The fourth station, KPFT in Houston, went on the air in 1970, and the fifth station, WPFW in Washington, 77. That's the Fab Five, that's the Pacifica family, and all of the affiliates like KBCS and Chaos and WSER, and the station we're going to tomorrow is celebrating in Mount Vernon, and then we're moving on to Oregon and Portland, KBOO. All this wonderful family that is the Pacifica extended family. I want to just talk about the one station, KPFT in Houston, that went on the air in 1970. Spring 1970, it goes on the air, and within a few weeks, it's blown off the air. The only radio station in the country. The Ku Klux Klan strapped dynamite to the base of the transmitter and blew it to smithereens right in the middle of Arlo Guthrie singing Alice's Restaurant. And I thought that was a good song. Actually, just a few days ago, Sunday night, we were in New Orleans. Jazz Fest was rained out. At least a good part of it Stevie Wonder didn't sing, but Arlo Guthrie did sing the full Alice's Restaurant. So KPFT has to rebuild, the station in the middle of the Petro Metro. And I mean, it's not like Pacifica had money for advertising. I guess the silver lining was that, well, the Klan certainly blew it into the consciousness of the potential listening audience of the people of Houston. I don't recommend that as an advertising strategy. And they got back on their feet, they rebuilt the transmitter, and they went back on the air. And the Klan blew them up again. This time with 15 times the dynamite. So now it's going to take months, right? And in January of 1971, it's a big story. PBS comes in to broadcast the moment this phoenix rises from the ashes. And Arlo Guthrie comes in to finish singing Alice's Restaurant. And it goes back on the air. Now, I can't remember if it was the Exalted Cyclops or the Grand Dragon, because I often confuse their titles. His proudest act. I think that's because he understood how dangerous Pacifica is, how dangerous independent media is. Dangerous because it allows people to speak for themselves. And when you hear someone speaking from their own experience, whether it is a Palestinian child or an Israeli grandmother, whether it's an uncle in Afghanistan or a kid in the South Valley, we were just speaking at RFK High School in the South Valley in Albuquerque, overwhelmingly undocumented student population in this high school, or a kid from the South Bronx. When you hear someone speaking from their own experience, it breaks down the caricatures and stereotypes that fuel the hate groups. You might say, it sounds like my baby, my bubba, my uncle, my aunt, and I'm not saying you're going to agree with them. How often do we agree with our family members? But you begin to understand where they're coming from. It makes it much harder to want to destroy them. You begin to understand where they're coming from. And that understanding is the beginning of peace. I think the media can be the greatest force for peace on earth. Instead, all too often, it's wielded as a weapon of war, which is why we have to take it back. I'm not wearing you guys out. history, like, 46 years ago, right? The Ku Klux Klan blew up KPFT. I cannot believe that we are talking about the Ku Klux Klan in this 2016 presidential election year. How could it be that the presumptive nominee of one of the major parties, the frontrunner of the Republican Party, Donald Trump, when asked on one of the networks on CNN if he would disavow support of a known Klan leader, an avowed Klan leader, David Duke, and the Ku Klux Klan, he waffled. He said, he would have to look more deeply into this. When was the last time you heard Donald Trump say he had to look more into anything before he spoke? What exactly is it that he had to investigate further? Which Klan chapter it was? Because he would want to generalize to all the Klan chapters in the United States. And, when you think about this, it's also why we need independent media. Yes, this was reported widely, but we have to talk about what the Klan was. I speak at a lot of universities and colleges, and, young people have heard of the Klan. But we have to be very serious about this. I come from New York. Democracy Now! Was the closest national broadcast to Ground Zero, September 11, 2001. That horror when 3,000 people were incinerated in an instant. We'll never know actually how many people died on that day, because those who go uncounted in life go uncounted in death. The undocumented workers and immigrants who might have been here will never actually know. But the horror of that moment. However, it wasn't the first time that terror came to U.S. soil. Ask any African American who has about what happened in this country. It was horrific. The Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, was a homegrown American terrorist organization. It terrorized whole populations. It brutalized, murdered, lynched thousands of people. We have to understand this so that it is not repeated. And this is why we need independent media to dig into the past and also to look forward. I was recently asked to come into AJ Plus in San Francisco to do a quick interview about the elections. Now, on this 100 city tour, we have no time for anything. Spokane to Seattle, we decided, we could save time, or Dennis did, by taking the 2 a.m. train from Spokane to Seattle so we could arrive in the morning and start, the day running. But I have to say, that was gorgeous. What a beautiful ride it was. And I absolutely love trains. So we're always in a massive rush. So we're getting this call as we were leaving San Francisco one of the few times in this last few weeks. So we get this call from AJ Plus, that's Al Jazeera Plus. Sadly, Al Jazeera America has folded. I hope the same thing doesn't happen with Al Jazeera overall. But AJ Plus continues, Al Jazeera Plus, it's Al Jazeera Online. And it's based in the offices of the old Current TV, which was owned by Vice President Al Gore. So you go there, you see its offices and everything. Al Jazeera bought it from him for $500 million. And So they called up, they said, would you come in and do an interview? And I said, I'm so sorry, I'm racing to the airport in San Francisco, we won't be able to make it. And they said, oh no, but we're right on the way. I said, yeah, right on the way. I mean, like 3 minutes, you could do it? Yes, they said, fine, 3 minutes. Really? Okay, we'll do it for 3 minutes. So we drove by, Dennis hardly moved the luggage in the car, didn't even come inside. I went in, sat down, did an interview for like 3 minutes, said hello to the staff, got out, and we made our plane. So that interview on the 2016 elections, they finally posted online this past week. I didn't check it today. I think early this morning or last night, it was at 11.7 million views. I always wonder how virtual, translates into the real world. I didn't say anything that I think most of you don't already think. It just so rarely hits the corporate media radar screen. They asked me what I thought of the coverage of Donald Trump. He is piped into everyone's home all the time. The other candidates have to trudge from state to state. And the Tyndall report looked at the coverage in 2015. Donald Trump got 23 times the coverage of Bernie Sanders. I think ABC World News Tonight gave Donald Trump 81 minutes, Bernie Sanders got 20 seconds. I'd really like to know what Bernie Sanders did that was so newsworthy that he should get 20 seconds. I want to look at one of the primaries, one of the primary nights. Super Tuesday 3, that was what they dubbed it this year. That was March 15th, 5 primaries. It was important. It was Ohio, Florida, North Carolina, Missouri, and Illinois. Illinois was the home state of Hillary Clinton. So all the media, the networks, covered wall-to-wall coverage that night. That was the night that Senator Marco Rubio, remember Senator Rubio? He did not win his home state, Florida, so he pulled out and they played his concession speech, as they should have. That was the night that John Kasich of Ohio, remember Governor Kasich? He won his first primary and they played his victory speech. Hillary Clinton had won 3 at that point, Ohio, Florida, and North Carolina. She was very smart to speak then because they didn't know what would happen in the next 2 states. And the media was saying that Sanders, Clinton, Missouri, Illinois, too close to call. Illinois was significant because it was her home state. So she spoke while she was ahead. Then they waited for Donald Trump, and all of them. As I said, I've been asked to be on CNN a few times to critique their coverage. Well, I don't know if they were meant for me to critique their coverage. Elections on Brian Stelter's show, which is the media show called Reliable Sources on Sunday morning. He's formerly with the New York Times. And, I said, I'm not going to single out CNN because I can't tell the difference between CNN and MSNBC. Donald Trump sounds the same on all 3 networks. They're broadcasting him with that lower third breaking news all the time, unless one of the networks has a little static. So they're now waiting for Donald Trump, and they've all got that upper right-hand box of an empty podium in one of his Florida mansions, and they're waiting for him to speak. And all the pundits and all the networks are chattering away. The pundits, the small circle of pundits on all the networks who know so little about so much. Finally he speaks, and they play the whole half hour. They said it was going to be a news conference. He pioneered this thing at the end of a primary at night to have a news conference. Remember what he'd done a few weeks before, an hour news conference where he trumpeted Trump water, Trump magazines, Trump steaks. It was this kind of bizarre. And they put the whole thing. Hillary Clinton had spoken in the middle of that. They recorded her speech and played it later. That was weeks before. But March 15th, they play his whole half hour. And that pretty much did it, right? They played Clinton, Cruz, they played Kasich, they played Rubio, they played Trump, and that was it. There wasn't anyone else, was there, that night? Who were some of those t-shirts? Bernie Sanders. See, there's something worse than negative coverage, and it is the vanishing. They did not mention, except to say it was neck and neck with Hillary Clinton, where he was or what he was doing that night. Now, I mean, had he fallen asleep? And that would have made Ariana Huffington very happy. You know, she just wrote this book, The Sleep Revolution, and I just was on Bill Maher with her, and I really wanted to debate with her. I told her the merits of sleeplessness. This annoyed her, and I sort of promised her I will take a long nap in June. So, where was Bernie Sanders, right? Had he taken the night off? In fact, and we were just in Arizona, Flagstaff, Tucson, and Phoenix. So I know this is true because I met many people there who attended his rally that night. He spoke before thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people. I think he started even before Donald Trump, so by that, you know, Donald Trump gets 23 times the coverage of Bernie Sanders. They could have played 1 minute of Bernie Sanders saying hello to everybody and then gone to the half hour of Donald Trump and everything would have been as it's been for the last year. But they didn't even do that. And none of the anchors on any of these networks speculated, like, where is Sanders? So we did something we didn't plan to do, but in response to that night, the next morning, we actually played an excerpt of Bernie Sanders' speech. I mean, who would have thunk it? Who would have thought it's a revolutionary act to play an excerpt of a speech of a major party candidate on the night of a major primary or the morning after? This is unacceptable. I mean, the guy has broken so many records, and he's done it without any echoes in the media. Imagine if sometimes he had the microphone. I mean, think about it. In March, he raised $44 million. Hillary Clinton raised $29 million. Bernie Sanders does it on the campaign trail, just says, please give. And people give $3 and $9 and $7 and $27, I think, is the average. So they never max out. They can keep on giving and giving. Now, for Hillary Clinton, and he has like well over 6 million donors. This hasn't happened before. She has a much smaller number of donors, but they give a lot, and they max out. We were in Laurel Canyon recently. And so was she, but we weren't at the same party. And she was at the party of George and Amal Clooney. And they had a fundraiser for her, and I think the going rate for the head table was something like $350,000. I mean, that was for a couple, so. And even George Clooney, when asked about it on the network, said he thought it was obscene. I mean, it was his party. That's right. But now this goes to another issue. It's not just Clinton. These candidates are raising obscene amounts of money. Where does this money go? I mean, you know, the coverage in the last few weeks, what happened in Washington, there was very little coverage of over 1,000 people protesting money in politics, right? Democracy swirling. Steps of Granny D. And they were even holding up signs and shouting out, where is CNN? Where is MSNBC? And could you imagine if 1,200 people were arrested in central Havana? Every major American news anchor would head down there now in a direct flight to cover this repressive country. But it was happening right there in our nation's capital. Hardly got any attention. Another reason to tune into Democracy Now! The money they raise, where does it go? The money they raise overwhelmingly goes to the networks. So they are hardly going to raise this. That money goes to paying for campaign advertising. So why would the networks question this? You might then counter and say, no, I saw a piece on campaign finance reform on one of the networks. It's not about a single piece. It's about the routine, daily, drumbeat coverage that sinks into people's consciousness. like the coverage they give to Donald Trump. What about spending that same amount of time questioning the corrupting influence of money in politics? Now, another thing I raised on CNN was, I said, what about an electoral season without polls? I mean, you tune into these networks. It is constant. You tune in and you see, she's up 20 points, 20 points, 20 points, he's moving up on the right, she's moving up on the left, she's moving up, he's moving back. And, I mean, it is mesmerizing, but at the end of the day, do you learn anything? These polls, constant, morning, noon, and night, that they are pouring their millions of dollars into, and then you get to a caucus or you get to a primary, and the poll is wrong, like Indiana, right? The poll is wrong. So they spend the next period of time from that primary or caucus to the next one talking about how they got it so wrong. Now, think about it. Why do we need these polls? When you're trying to make up your own mind, do you really care what your barber thinks, your librarian, your doctor, your whoever your family thinks? What you need is the networks to spend that millions of dollars and energy and investigation into the records of these politicians and businessmen. With their records. That is a media serving a democratic society. Now, you might be going in the sort of back of your mind, no, I think polls can be helpful. Well, I actually do too, and we have them every single week. They are called primaries and caucuses. At the end of the day, those are fact-based polls. At the end of the day, you learn who voted, who didn't, racial breakdown, age breakdown, the disparity in income, all the different, very important issues. Then it's interesting, who voted in Indiana, who didn't, who voted here, who didn't. And, one of the big numbers is who doesn't vote. More than 80% of people aren't voting in these primaries and caucuses. It's truly astounding, even with a galvanized population. And then there are the impediments to voting. I mean, what happened in Phoenix, Arizona is insane. 200 polling places, which was down from 400 in the last election. 200 polling places. For this primary, they closed 140 of them. This is with a galvanized electorate. They only had 60 polling places open. Now, could it be it has to do with the growing Latino population in Phoenix? Well, that's not what the authorities said. They said they were trying to save money. Really? So I thought, well, by that same token, why open any polling place at all? Think how much you could save. I mean, of course, you're threatening democracy, and then, of course, there's the issue of IDs and the evisceration of the Voting Rights Act. In Texas, you can't present a student ID, but you can present a gun license. And then the millions of people who have served time in prison or been charged with a felony, who have had any brush with the criminal justice system, in some cases, you can never vote again. You can come out of prison, but you can never vote again. In other places, if you're on parole or probation, it's very hard to figure out. And in some places, like Vermont and Maine, you can vote from prison. So, it runs the gamut. But we need to be able to match what most of the industrialized world has done. Get most of the population out to vote. It is appalling how few people vote in the United States. You need holidays for election days or weekend voting. I can see people are getting a little restless, and I have to go through an entire year of activism, and I'm going to do this super fast, but I want to look at the year 2011. Movements matter. Movements make a difference, and that was the year that the bottom rocked the top. So I want to start, in December of 2010. That was the Tunisian Revolution. That was when a young man named Mohamed Bouazizi came out of university. There was no opportunity, corrupt dictator, so he ends up having to sell fruits and vegetables in the marketplace, and the authorities harass him. They take his scales. Mohamed Bouazizi can't take it anymore, and he sets himself on fire. And that sparked the Tunisian Revolution. Other things did too, like WikiLeaks. Right, WikiLeaks released the Afghan war logs, the Iraq war logs, and the State Department cables. It's not as if the Tunisian people didn't know their dictator was corrupt, but what they learned was the American government knew it, but still shored him up to the tune of millions of dollars. It just increased their fury. And then, of course, the Tunisian revolution, threw out the despot, and then inspired the Egyptian revolution. And what happened there was historic. 1 million people in Tahrir, not to mention every other city in Egypt. And they threw out Mubarak after decades. I won't go more into that. It is an unfinished revolution. The turn it's taken now is frightening, is a very difficult time in Egypt. But I do think the Arab Spring then inspired Wisconsin, right? This mass protest of 150,000 people. Okay, I think the Governor Scott Walker, had something to do with it, right? What did he do? He gets elected and he says he's going to bust the public unions. Well, the teachers and the nurses he's going to go after, not the firefighters and the cops. He assures them, not you. Governor Walker's problem is that the police and the firefighters were married to the teachers. I saw some scenes in the state capitol. They occupied the whole place. People across the political spectrum. We raced into Wisconsin. I saw some of the biggest guys I'd ever seen, the Oshkosh prison guards. I went up to them and I said, who did you vote for? And they said, Governor Walker. And I said, well, what are you doing here? And they said, protesting Governor Walker, of course. And then outside, in freezing cold, over 100,000 people, older gentlemen, glasses, white hair, is marching with a homemade placard that said, IRS auditors against Walker. And I said, are you a Democrat or Republican? Republican. I said, isn't the governor a Republican? He said, yes, but he didn't say he was going to do this to us, and he just kept marching. And I looked out at this vista of protests. Wisconsin's such an interesting state, right? It's the home of the John Birch Society, the racist, segregationist, anti-civil rights, anti-King organization. It was co-founded by Fred Koch, the father of the oil barons, David and Charles Koch. And then there is AFSCME, founded in 1932 in Wisconsin, the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees. And as I looked out on this vista of protest across the Capitol grounds, I saw the Wisconsin State Labor History Museum. And if you think, what difference did that protest make? The governor was reelected. Well, all protest matters. He did run for president, had to pull out pretty fast, and I think this had something to do with it. But as Margaret Mead said, never doubt for a moment that a small group of thoughtful, committed people can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And this was more than a small group of thoughtful, committed people. Go back to April 4th, 1968, the day Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. What was he doing there? He was simply going to stand with sanitation workers who were organizing a local of AFSCME. And go back a year before that to the day, April 4th, 67, Dr. King at Riverside Church in New York decides to speak out against the war in Vietnam. His inner circle says, don't do it, Martin. They say you've got the most powerful person on earth, the President of the United States, wrapped around your finger. Right, Lyndon Johnson, you got him to sign the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. This is not your war. Don't do this. And he said no. He said he was going to speak out. He saw the triple threat of materialism, racism, and militarism. And he addressed the thousands of people who packed the church and said, my country, the United States, is the greatest purveyor of violence on earth. The corporate press excoriated him, blasted him. They said his speech sounded like a script from Radio Hanoi. They said he had done a disservice to his cause, his country, his people. And so he just doubled down, spoke louder, spoke more often, and a year later he would be killed. But action matters. And then let's jump forward to the summer of 2011. That was the Keystone XL protests around the White House, ring around the World Trade. Thousands of people marched. 1,200 people got arrested among them. It was Naomi Klein's first arrest, who wrote the most amazing amazing books, right? She wrote This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. Everyone should read it. She wrote Shock Doctrine, Rise of Disaster Capitalism. Everyone should read it. She wrote No Logo, Taking Aim at Brown Bullies. Everyone should read it. Bill McKibben got arrested, founder of 350.org. And then you move forward 3 weeks, and it was September 17, 2011, Occupy. Right? Thousands of people streaming to Zuccotti Park, and they occupied Wall Street. And they set up these encampments. The media hardly covered it for the first week, the vanishing. And then when it was just ridiculous, and they had to, they mocked them. And they said things like, I remember Erin Burnett had just started CNN's, the show she does called Out Front. Her first piece was called, on Occupy, was called Seriously? And this is what they did. They said, what do these people want? They can't decide. They're against the death penalty, they're against racism, they're against war, they're against injustice, inequality, they're concerned about climate change. I thought, oh my God, they're listening. Those things, like King, they saw it all as a seamless web. It was their strength, it wasn't their weakness. And then they'd say, they can't even choose a spokesperson. Right? No, it's a leaderful movement, not a leaderless movement. And among the signs that people carried into Zuccotti Park, well, before I say that, yes, the encampments were eviscerated by the police. We went to so many of them in Oakland and Louisville and New York. But for those who say, what happened to that movement, it sure fizzled out, didn't amount to a hill of beans. Oh, I beg to differ. They occupied the language. I think occupy is the word most looked up or used in 2011. You say the word 1%, 99%, absolutely everyone knows what you mean. You change the language, you change the world. And among the signs held on that day was a sign that said, I am Troy Davis, and too much doubt. Many people held that sign. And so we went from Occupy 4 days later to Jackson, Georgia, where Georgia's death row prison is. We went to see what would happen to this man, Troy Anthony Davis. And very quickly, for those of you who don't know his story, just a few moments to talk about what would happen. On September 21st, 2011, Troy Anthony Davis was scheduled to die. We were reporting live from the grounds outside Georgia's death row in the town of Jackson, awaiting news about whether the U.S. Supreme Court would spare his life. I am Troy Davis had become a rallying cry of people all over the world. There were protests this day, September 21st, 2011, in Japan and Iceland and Germany and France and Britain. The effort had grown, a growing international movement, including not just the traditional anti-death penalty activists, but also prosecutors, prison wardens, a former U.S. president, and the Pope. This is the story of a struggle against death that refuses to die. Troy Anthony Davis was 18 years old. It was August 18, 1989. African-American teenager. He went with a friend to Charlie Brown's pool hall in Savannah, Georgia, where he grew up. In the parking lot outside, Red Coles, a neighborhood tough, was arguing loudly with a homeless man named Larry Young. Several witnesses testified Coles pistol whipped Young. Pool hall patrons came out to see what was going on. Troy Davis tried to intervene in the fight, but fled when Coles threatened him with a gun. At 1:15 in the morning, Mark McPhail, a white off-duty Savannah police officer who was working as a security guard at a Greyhound bus station next door, came outside to break up the fight. Gunshots pierced the summer night. Moments later, McPhail lay dying with a bullet wound to the head and another to the heart. He never drew his gun. He was a hero cop. He tried to save a homeless man. Red Coles immediately went to the police station with a lawyer and pointed the finger at Troy Davis. Next day, Troy Davis's face would be plastered all over the newscasts everywhere. His family was desperately trying to reach Troy. He was in Atlanta with a cousin looking for a job. His sister, Martina Correa, who is a heroine. Martina was a Persian Gulf Army nurse. I have interviewed her so many times. She came back from the Persian Gulf War. She was diagnosed with breast cancer, and then she didn't just try to save her own life, but her face adorned the mammogram vans and throughout Savannah to try to get black women and poor women to get mammograms. She was honored as a leading light in Washington with Nancy Pelosi, a remarkable woman, but now she was trying to save her brother's life. She called Troy, said, "You have to get back here to Savannah." She picked him up in Atlanta. They came back, and 18-year-old Troy turns himself into the Chatham County Sheriff's Office, thinking it was a case of mistaken identity, and he'd just clear up the confusion. He was charged with first-degree murder. He was held in jail for 2 years. He'd be tried in 1991. A jury deliberated for 2 hours and returned a guilty verdict. On August 30th, 1991, Troy Davis, age 20, was sentenced to die. Davis would spend the next 20 years on death row. During that time, 7 of the 9 non-police witnesses recanted or changed their testimony, many saying that police intimidated them, and that's why they gave their original false statements. One who refused to recant was Red Coles. The one who so many said was the actual killer. No physical evidence linked Davis to the killing. So let me turn now to that day that we went to Jackson, Georgia. I was there with an amazing team, our senior producer, Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, who set up the newsroom at the Klan Target in KPFT in Houston, and Hani Massoud, who leaps tall buildings in a single bound. And we were there. We didn't know what would happen that day. There were 3 other death warrants against Troy. Each one of them had been vacated. Who knew if the same thing wouldn't happen with this 4th death warrant? So we got to the grounds of the prison. If we could have broadcast from the execution chamber, we would have. I really think it's critical to show the images. People in this country don't realize how alone we are in the industrialized world and instituting the death penalty. On that day, we couldn't obviously broadcast from the death chamber, but we hired a satellite truck like the big boys, we're going to go into a studio. And we saw on the prison grounds that the satellite trucks were all on the periphery, yet the protest pen was set up over here. The guards would allow 150 protesters, Martina at the center, human rights leaders like the head of Amnesty and NAACP, people from around the world. Martina in the wheelchair, she would die weeks later of breast cancer. So she was over here and all of them packed into this pen. I mean, we had come to this place to go to where the silence is. We weren't going to go to the periphery and just speak ourselves. Now, the other networks, why weren't they complaining? I mean, what were they going to report for 20 or 30 seconds? What real difference did it make? But for us, and I was really annoyed because our satellite truck that Fox would use, that CNN would use, that we hired that day was late. We didn't know who this team was, but suddenly they came up on the grounds with a satellite truck and they said, "Roll down the window, ma'am, where do you want the satellite truck?" I said, "Oh, well, the guards are saying we have to put it over there. Where do you want the satellite truck?" I said, "Oh, I'm warming up to these guys." I said, "Well, I was thinking right over there by the protest pen. We can barrel this truck over to the protest pen." And then the prison guards come running over, and these guys get out of the satellite truck. They were bigger than the Oshkosh prison guards. And they get out their huge cameras, and the guards backed off. And they handed me the microphone, and they formed a kind of protective semicircle around me, and they said, "Where do you want to stand?" I said, "Right up against the rope so I can reach over and interview people." They handed me the mic and said, "Start the show." And so we did. Now, we had with us the press packet from the Department of Corrections. It was very thin. It did say what Troy's schedule would be that day, that he would meet with family till 3, then they had to clear out so he could get his routine physical. Routine physical? They're going to execute him in 4 hours, and they want to know if he, has high cholesterol? No, a Texas prisoner before that who was on death row, attempted suicide. They raced him to the hospital, they got him better, and then they executed him. So then the next page talked about what he would be served for dinner. See, he had turned down the special meal that the death row prisoner could get ice cream and steak and stuff. And so they talked about what he would be offered, the standard fare, in detail. Grilled cheeseburgers, oven brown potatoes, baked beans, coleslaw, cookies, and a great beverage. And the next page was just 4 lines. It listed the lethal cocktail that would follow. Pentobarbital, pancuronium bromide, potassium chloride, and Ativan, a sedative. The pentobarbital anesthetizes, the pancuronium bromide paralyzes, the potassium chloride stops the heart. Troy refused the sedative and the Last Supper. We started broadcasting at 6 o'clock. By 7 o'clock, the U.S. Supreme Court was reportedly reviewing Davis's plea for a stay. The case was referred to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who hails from Pinpoint, Georgia, a community founded by freed slaves that's near Savannah. The Supreme Court denied the plea. Davis's execution began at 10:53 p.m. The prison spokesperson delivered the news to the reporters outside, time of death, 11:08 p.m. The eyewitnesses to the execution stepped out. According to an Associated Press reporter who was there, these were Troy Davis's final words. He said, "I'd like to address the McPhail family, let you know I'm not the one who killed your son, your father, your brother. I didn't have a gun. I am innocent." He said, "All I can ask is that you look deeper into this case so that you really can finally see the truth." He then said, "I ask my family and friends to continue to fight this fight." And then he looked at his executioners and said, "For those about to take my life, God have mercy on your souls, and may God bless your souls." The state of Georgia took Davis's body to Atlanta for an autopsy, charging his family for the transportation. In Troy Davis's death certificate, the cause of death is listed simply as homicide. As we stood on the grounds of the prison just after Troy Davis was executed, the Georgia Department of Corrections threatened to pull the plug on our broadcast. The show was over. I was reminded of what Mahatma Gandhi reportedly answered when asked what he thought of Western civilization. He said, "I think it would be a good idea." Before I end the year with the UN Climate Summit in December, just a few quick things. Dennis and I are going to be signing books, and I really hope that you come up, but I could certainly understand if you don't want to wait. If you get 2 books, you get this amazing DVD that Nermeen Sheikh and I did with Glenn Greenwald, talking to him about everything from Brazil, which he calls a coup, to, of course, what he did with Edward Snowden, the amazing work that he and Laura Poitras did in exposing took out of the country because he was concerned if he didn't leave the country, these documents would never see the light of day, and that you wouldn't know about your country, your government spying on the American people. So why would you get $2? Well, you could give one to a library or give one to friends, stockpile gifts for the holidays. But Dennis mentioned that I think that Democracy Now!, the book, 20 years covering the movement's changing America, debuted on the New York Times bestseller list. So this is an amazing feat. It came out April 12th, considering the New York Times almost never mentions Democracy Now! So in the past, our books have also hit the bestseller list, but this time we thought, just to see those 2 words in the New York Times, Democracy Now!, we call it that. And then they can't choose because it's just kind of a mathematical equation. We have this joke that Webster's will eventually redefine exclusive as having been heard on Democracy Now! Last year or last month. What the other networks call their exclusive. But it really makes a difference to get on the bestseller list. How? It gets into a number of libraries that often just stock the bestsellers, not to mention prison libraries. There are a lot of bookstores that are not like Elliott Bay. Elliott Bay is an amazing bookstore, and it's a dream to work with them when you come to Seattle. Bookstores have closed, independent bookstores, and we can't let this happen. And unlike Elliott Bay, a lot of bookstores only stock the bestsellers. And wonderful people go into those bookstores, and we want to introduce them to other galaxies, other universes of thought, roadmaps to other media, because I think really people are seeking this. I think that, most people care about war and peace, growing inequality, climate change, the fate of the planet. Those people are not a fringe minority, not even a silent majority, but the silenced majority, silenced by the corporate media. And we want to be right there, front and center, to open up these worlds so that so many other people can get access to what many of you have had the joy and privilege of knowing about in your lives. So I want to end speaking of the words of the heretics and the whistleblowers, the troublemakers over the last 20 years. I want to end in the Durban Summit of 2011. You went that Democracy Now! Goes to every climate summit from Copenhagen to Cancun to Cochabamba to Durban to Doha to Poland to Peru and then to Paris. You might say, given what happens in these summits, why waste the fuel? Yeah. It's because of what happens outside, the thousands of uninvited guests, people from the most desperate places on earth, desperate because their countries will perhaps be no more. Like the 15-year-old boy from the Maldives who said, my country will be submerged. The people of sub-Saharan Africa who are talking about the desertification of a continent, the cooking of a continent, and they look to us, the historically greatest greenhouse gas emitter, and also the largest now in China. They look to us and they demand change. And it's critical that we be there with our microphones, not only covering their demands, their descriptions of what's happening, and their debates. They debate climate change, what to do about it. In our country, we debate whether human beings have anything to do with climate change. It is astounding. The science is settled. It's as if every time we talked about the planet Earth, we brought on someone from the Flat Earth Society for balance. So, let me end with Anjali Apatare. She was a young woman who was at College of the Atlantic in Maine, where we'll be speaking in 2 weeks. And Anjali, for this year, young people, an unusual moment from the outside, were invited in for the end of the summit. And so Anjali Apatare addressed the summit. And this is a part of what Anjali had to say. She said, I speak for more than half the world's population. We are the silent majority. You've given us a seat in this hall, but our interests are not on the table. What does it take to get a stake in this game? Lobbyists, corporate influence, money? You've been negotiating all of my life. You failed to meet pledges, you've missed targets, you've broken promises, but you've heard this all before. We're in Africa, home to communities on the front line of climate change. The science tells us we have 5 years max. You say, give us 10. The starkest betrayal of your generation's responsibility to ours is you call this ambition. Where is the courage in these rooms? Now is not the time for incremental action. In the long run, these will be seen as the defining moments of an era in which narrow self-interest prevailed over science, reason, and common compassion. She said there is real ambition in this room, but it's been dismissed as radical, deemed not politically possible. Stand with Africa. Long-term thinking is not radical. What's radical is to completely alter the planet's climate, to betray the future of my generation, to condemn millions to death by climate change. What's radical is to write off the fact that change is within our reach. 2011 was the year in which the silent majority found their voice, the year when the bottom shook the top. 2011 was the year when the radical became reality. And then she quoted Nelson Mandela, who said, "It always seems impossible until it's done." And she looked out at the crowd of 1,000 people, the delegates, the government leaders, the bureaucrats, the scientists, and said, "So distinguished elegants in governments around the world, governments of the developed world, deep cuts now, get it done." She dared to go to where the silence was. And I'll end where I began, back in World War II, with the White Rose Collective, a brother and sister named Hans and Sophie Scholl in Germany, Nazi Germany. Together with their professor, they said, what can we do in the face of the Nazi atrocity? They weren't Jewish, they were German Christians. And they decided to form the White Rose Collective with students, professors, and workers. And they get information out so the Germans would never be able to say they didn't know. And they made this series of 6 pamphlets, and on one of them were written the words, "We will not be silent." They distributed these pamphlets everywhere under cover of night, in alleyways, marketplaces, schoolyards. And then Hans and Sophie and their professor were caught. They were charged, they were tried, they were convicted, and they were beheaded. But that philosophy, that motto, should be the Hippocratic Oath of the media today, should be the Hippocratic Oath of us all today. We will not be silent. Democracy.